Getting into the fiction that Lovecraft wrote is probably the worst thing that ever happened to me. It significantly raised my power level, if you catch my drift, during a time where I was still the weird, awkward asshole who sat at the back of class and didn't talk to anybody. My entire personality eventually stemmed from how much I knew about the Lovecraft mythos, and if you were my friend at the time, I won't ask for forgiveness, rather that it be forgotten entirely. For anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, Howard Phillips Lovecraft was an American horror writer whose works were published in old pulp magazines like Weird Tales during the 20s and 30s. His stories usually played with the reader's fear of the unknown, often opting not to describe the creatures or incidents his characters encountered and letting the reader fill in the gaps for themselves. This writing style has since been referred to as cosmic horror, and by today's standards it's relatively benign. The insignificance of humanity and the demonstrable scale of the universe were ideas that generally went unexplored by laypeople circa 1928 when Call of Cthulhu was published, but nowadays you can go into any public middle school and find kids with face tattoos hitting jewels and shooting heroin because they all read To Kill a Mockingbird in class once. These stories serve as a time capsule to an almost lost era of horror and laid the foundations for many of today's horror archetypes and tropes, but actually sitting down and reading them is a goddamn chore. I'm often at a loss for why I was so eager to dive into Lovecraft's discography, but at that point in time I'd have rather danced to Deadly Disco with Azathoth herself than do anything, really. It's possible that the nihilistic and existential portrayal of humanity appealed to my edgy 14-year-old self in just the right way for it to stick and never leave. Something that a lot of newcomers to the mythos don't realize is that the hierarchy of deities in cosmic history generally doesn't come from the books, or at least isn't spelled out as clearly as the wiki would have you believe. There are mentions of entities like Yog-Sothoth and Dagon in the stories, sure, but all that extra stuff you read about is background information, and was purposefully left unexplained by Lovecraft, because he wanted the readers to think and assume rather than read and understand. All that stuff on the wiki can be considered expansion content, I suppose, and it's usually by other authors, and we'll never know if any of it is canon because Lovecraft died of cancer in 1937. Don't let that discourage you from reading mythos content from other authors, though. The King in Yellow is a much better read than the majority of Lovecraft's originals. Cosmic horror has a history of being completely bastardized for the sake of media, games, and merchandising in the past, but so far none have been more infamous or more fun than Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. Call of Cthulhu is a game for nerds of a more existential variety, and unlike most tabletop RPGs, it's technically a game you can win. The reason I bring up the Chaosium game is that Call of Cthulhu 2018 claims to be based off of the same pen and paper system the Chaosium game runs on, and that's an abject lie, but we'll get to that in a minute. When the trailers for this game finally reached me sometime late 2017, I was flooded with the same kind of pained optimism you might get from being invited by your best friend to a party that you know you aren't going to like. Development for this game started around 2014 under Frogwares, who are the Sherlock Holmes guys. We now know that their publisher, Focus Home Interactive, either didn't like the direction Frogwares was taking the game or didn't like how long it was going to take to develop and took the Call of Cthulhu label away from them and gave it to Cyanide Studios, who are famous for the Styx series, Space Hulk Deathwing, and about 25 different games about managing a professional cycling team. So it is generally safe to say that the mess we got was of Cyanide's own design, and the Frogwares version of the game is now called The Sinking City, which seems to be a much more action-focused and video-gamey game than the Cyanide one. Frogwares' version seems to be fueled more by the flame that spawned Magrunner Dark Pulse, having been released only a year before development on Call of Cthulhu started. Magrunner is a puzzle game about magnets a la Portal, except Cthulhu is there, and honestly it's pretty neat. I might do a video on that game too. Unfortunately for Cyanide, that meant that they had to develop a fully fleshed out, narrative-driven, cosmic horror-inspired masterpiece to live up to the Call of Cthulhu name, and since they acquired the contract for development in 2016, they only had 2 years to do it. Now I know that 2 years seems like plenty of time for some things to get done, like taking out the trash or washing your hair, but in video game development time that's like racing the clock to turn in a huge essay before midnight. So October 30th comes around, the game comes out, I watch my yearly episode of Skeleton Warriors, as is the Halloween Eve tradition, and as soon as the game is downloaded, I strap my ass to my office chair and spend the next 10 hours of my mortal life playing, finishing, and subsequently regretting the Call of Cthulhu. So on launch day, Call of Cthulhu was pretty fucked up. It had a frame rate issue that I could only fix by running it in Windows Vista compatibility mode, there was no FOV slider in the options menu, and there was a ton of jank, though that can generally be excused because of the studio it came from. I can excuse the frame rate thing and the jank because these are both common problems with Cyanide games, but I'm fairly certain that having an FOV slider in your options menu is just a box that you check in Unreal 4. I don't know, it just seems lazy. I've purposefully left the FOV as low as it was on launch so you get the full experience. Funny story about that actually, I almost threw up about halfway through the second chapter because I was looking at a screen with such a low field of vision, so I ended up playing the rest of the game a few feet away from my desk with my mouse and keyboard on my lap, so that's why the footage is choppy. And this problem is made worse by the addition of the panic attack mechanic. This is what that looks like.
I gotta. Oh, I can't breathe. What's happening?
Sometimes when your character gets extra spooked, some old god juice creeps in from off screen as he stumbles around and breathes really hard like he just got separated from his buddies at an anime convention. These little episodes can last between 10 seconds to a minute and are triggered seemingly at random. Combining this and the dangerously low field of vision may have actually been the work of a Lovecraftian deity because no human should be able to see this and not immediately try to fix it. Needless to say, this game was critically panned on launch, but so was Dark Corners of the Earth if Wikipedia serves me, so who knows, this game might be a cult classic someday. IGN gave it an 8. Classic. Since launch, there have been a couple of patches for bug fixes and language support, as well as the addition of a functional field of vision slider, so if you're like me and you can't play games without feeling sick unless the screen is almost looking at the back of your own head, they've got you covered now. Something that hasn't changed at all since launch day is the quality of the animation and voice acting. And it shouldn't. Because it's perfect. Really though, the voice acting is serviceable. I guess I'm not a voice actor, that's Nathaniel's job, but the animation is very subpar even compared to Cyanide's other games. And the more you see it, the more you notice stuff like people's fingers and wrists not moving or desynced audio during dialogues. These may seem like negligible problems, but once you catch it happening, it's the only thing you see. From an artistic standpoint, it doesn't look the best, but it has its moments, and when there isn't a layer of green saran wrap over your eyes, it's almost pretty. There were a few very strange modeling issues as well, mainly the poorly implemented cloth physics, but what got me to notice it was the metal police badge on this cop's shirt seemed to be moving and stretching as his idle animation ran, like he was wearing a skin-tight bodysuit instead of a real shirt. I'm now going to give you a short summary of the story. It's going to be very spoiler heavy, so if you're still planning on playing this game, you can skip to the timestamp on screen. This is going to be the quickest rundown of the plot and story elements I can manage because I've written this part of the script about 11 times now, and there's just so little here to talk about that I can barely make jokes. Alright, time for video game. You are Edward Pierce, a grumbly war veteran turned detective who has a drinking problem and abuses barbiturates regularly. If that sounds like the most generic, interchangeable horror mystery protagonist ever, you would be correct. Pierce is visited by a man named Stephen Webster, who pleads for you to investigate the death of his daughter and renowned painter, Sarah Hawkins, and her family. The Hawkins were a very wealthy family who died in a freak house fire, and whose absence has affected their island community greatly. Pierce has a gut feeling there is more going on than what the report suggests, though. That, and he's threatened with losing his detective's license if he doesn't take on a new case soon. So off our hero goes to Darkwater Islands to save his job and also solve the case if he can be bothered. There is evidence at the Hawkins mansion that supports at least one of the adults survived the fire, but the kid is definitely 100% for sure dead.
The child's corpse left a trace.
After some time investigating the mansion, Pierce is caught off guard by a robed cultist who flees to Charles Hawkins' office and disappears, only to be followed by Pierce and Officer Bradley into a network of underground caves. A cult worshipping strange outer gods is diligently at work in these tunnels and is acting very spooky. In these caves, Pierce discovers Charles Hawkins, fully alive and Lovecraftified. A cave-in starts, you almost get crushed to death, and you wake up in the basement/mental ward of the Darkwater Hospital. And since Pierce was never taught any patience or negotiation skills as a child, you escape from the hospital in a shitty stealth section with very bad AI. What happens after the segment at the hospital is almost entirely irrelevant to the overall plot by now, except for the introduction of a character named Algernon Drake, who is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs from reading passages from a copy of the Necronomicon he received from a colleague at the Miskatonic University. If you know Lovecraft, you know why my tone changed. Everything except the introduction of Algernon can be summed up by a bunch of dumb shit happens until Chapter 9, where you find Sarah Hawkins alive in a cell in the same asylum that Pierce was in a few chapters earlier. Charles tries to stop you from escaping with Sarah, but you set the hospital on fire and kill Charles with an axe Pierce pulls literally out of his ass. Pierce understandably gets arrested for setting the hospital on fire, and the spooky voice who's been whispering H.P. Lovecraft brand unearthly horrors registered trademark into your brain the whole game appears to you and forces you to submit to your destiny.
I am the one men named Leviathan.
Meanwhile, Sarah and Algernon go off to wrap up a side plot, and she turns evil because the story still needs an antagonist, even though it's heavily implied that she's been in contact with these outer beings for a very long time, and only just now is going crazy? Pierce and Sarah meet at Alabaster Point, and you end the game by choosing to either go through with Sarah's ritual and summon Cthulhu, do a counter ritual with Algernon that keeps Cthulhu asleep but causes Pierce to go insane, committing suicide on the spot, or just calling time out and going home. Those last two options are only made available by some inane prerequisites you complete while playing. I've played through the whole game 3 times now, and I've never gotten the option to just go home. I skipped over a lot of stuff in that summary, but I'm going to bring up one of the story beats that really bugged me. This thing with the Shambler, it's not good. Throughout the game, characters make reference to an entity called the Shambler. With no context to go on, I assumed this was in reference to the Shambler from the Stars, which is a mythos story written by Robert Bloch. What I did not expect was a rejected Metro monster jumping out of a painting and making me do another stealth section. So my fault for thinking of the wrong Shambler, right? There are plenty to get confused about. Well, later, some characters start referring to it as the Dimensional Shambler, which is a Lovecraft monster, but a different thing entirely. The Dimensional Shamblers from the horror at the museum are a race of immaterial hunters from a lower dimension that use hypnotism to lure their prey through a portal and back to their reality so they can be killed and presumably eaten. This Shambler just stabs people. This isn't a mythos creature at all, it's a creepypasta my 15-year-old brother wrote. Now that I'm done complaining, this game could have been one hell of a lot worse than what we got. I know for a fact that me and my friends got chumped by No Man's Sky and Anthem in recent memory, and probably a lot of stuff before that, too. The main thing about this one is that it was overly ambitious for its development time. Or Cyanide was purposefully underachieving on this so it could launch on date, and as of writing the script for this video, I still can't figure out which it is. There's some evidence for both, like Pierce pulling that axe out of his ass could have been the only remaining fragment of an ill-conceived combat system that was instead turned into this.
Was going to the whaling station. Stop. Oh, God. What am I doing?
Or they just rushed the shit, like with these numbers. None of these do anything except for strength, which is used once in gameplay, right here. The higher your strength stat is, the less you miss, and if you max it out, you bring the possibility of you missing to 0. You can do this at the beginning of the game. The only other times you would use these stats are in dialogues, which isn't all that useful considering I'm playing this as a video game and not a surrogate for the boring parts of Mass Effect. This is either a product of crunch or laziness, and I don't particularly care to find out which anymore. I've spent too much time on this video, and the more I work on it, the more I think of what this game could have been instead of what I got. I'm not going to be giving the media I review on this channel numerical ratings, but I am going to tell you whether or not I think it's worth your time, and Call of Cthulhu 2018 is not. Go read Abdullah Hazret again if you really want some Lovecraft today.